On an April evening in 1964, a policeman's routine chase turned into a journey beyond the laws of nature when he found himself face to face with a craft that left scorch marks on the earth and even larger questions in the sky. Let's return to the events of Socorro UFO case here on Things Visible and Invisible. Kevin Randle is a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel who served in Vietnam, Iraq and the Middle East. His interest in UFOs began as a teenager when he investigated a sighting while living in Colorado. Since then, he has investigated hundreds of similar sightings around the US, as well as spending nearly 3 decades researching the events in Roswell. And he joins me down the line from his home in Iowa. Kevin, welcome to Things Visible and Invisible.
I'm glad to be here. I'm glad we made it.
Kevin, it's very tempting to talk to you about Roswell, but I want to talk to you about another case, another UFO case, which a lot of people will not know about, and that is the Socorro case, which happened in the 1960s. If you'd be so kind, give us the basic outline of what that case entailed.
It's April 24th, 1964. Lonnie Zamora is a police officer in Socorro, New Mexico, and he's chasing a speeder through the town. It's a very small town. He hears an explosion or some kind of detonation on the edge of town, so he breaks off that chase and heads to that location. He comes up over a rise. He sees what he thinks is an overturned car down in an arroyo. He heads the car down there, and as he gets closer, he realizes it's not an overturned car. It's some kind of an egg-shaped craft sitting on the ground. He sees 2 small beings outside the craft. They then spot him. They run back into the craft. There's a sound of a door closing or a hatch slamming shut, and the craft lives off in a blue flame and takes off into the distance. At the same time, Zamora called a good friend of his who is in the New Mexico State Police to come to the scene. That man, Sam Chavez, may have arrived just in time to see the craft as it disappeared in the distance. He didn't see it on the ground. At the same time, before Zamora actually got there, the police department received 3 or 4 phone calls from residents talking about this roaring thing in the sky. They didn't bother to take any names. They didn't bother to write anything down. But Captain Richard Holder, who investigated the case within hours of Zamora seeing it, talked to the police officers. And that very night, he confirmed that there had been calls to the police station. So we have a case with a landed craft. There's landing gear imprints. There's you might say, charred remains of the liftoff of the craft. There's strange footprints in that area, and there's other witnesses that see some of that sort of thing. So it's a very important case. It's one of the very few, and I think there's only 3 in the Project Blue Book files, where occupants were reported, beings were reported, that the Air Force didn't write it off as some kind of a psychological problem. And in fact, Lieutenant Colonel Quintanilla, who was the chief of Project Blue Book at the time, labeled it as unidentified. So we have a sighting of a UFO on the ground with the creatures, and the Air Force was unable to identify a plausible explanation for it.
Now, Kevin, that's an extremely helpful, very succinct summary of a very complex case, which we're going to dig into in further detail. But just to answer me some basic questions, because I'm thinking as you're speaking, for people outside the United States, how far are we talking from Roswell, which I know is in that general southwestern part of the United States? Are we talking a great distance, or are they relatively close?
Well, when we're talking United States and distances, especially in the western states, the distances are pretty far apart. To get the easiest way to get to from Roswell to Socorro, and I made the drive several times, was to go through a couple of small towns. One of them called San Antonio, as a matter of fact, that's in New Mexico. I'm thinking it's maybe 3 or 4 hours of a drive to get from Roswell to Socorro.
Okay, so it's close, but not that close in a sense.
Yeah.
So this is 1960s United States. Roswell, 1940s United States, got an awful lot, at least initially an awful lot of press coverage and then silence for many decades. What happened in this case?
Oh, it was big news right after it happened. I remember seeing reports of it on the CBS Evening News at the time it happened. So it was well reported throughout the country because it had all the real elements. J. Allen Hynek, who was the Air Force consultant to Project Blue Book, was sent in to investigate. Other military personnel were sent in to investigate. So they spent a lot of time and effort trying to solve the case. Unable to do so, but it was big at the time. Roswell at the time, virtually nobody had ever heard of. It had been eliminated as a weather balloon back in 1947. You would see it pop up periodically in books or magazines, but it would be a very short notation, and usually all the facts were wrong, other than it was in Roswell, New Mexico. Socorro was immediately well known throughout the country, and we didn't have the problem with the military or the press or anyone else providing an easy solution for it. The Lorenzens, Jim and Coral Lorenzen, who were the head of APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization in Tucson, Arizona, which, by the way, is 4 or 5 hours away from Socorro, got there the next day, and they were talking to Zamora and some of the other people about it. And they, of course, publicized it in their bulletin. I think NICAP had their representative there, and there were other newspaper reporters who came in at the time. So it was a big case.
But what was the general tone of the reporting, Kevin? I mean, we know from history that sometimes these things are, if there's a slow day on the news desk, they get a lot of prominence. But sometimes they're also treated as kind of slightly curiosities. You know, there's something not really news. What was the tone of the sort of CBS reports and others? Was this taking it seriously, or was it sort of head scratching a bit?
I think that the tone was sort of tongue in cheek. They were kind of reporting it seriously, but they were also trying to give the impression, well, I'm too sophisticated to believe in flying saucers. So I'm kind of looking at this at askance. But Lonnie Zamora was a police officer who had a good reputation among the older people in Socorro. And I say that because the teenagers didn't like him because he was always handing out speeding tickets to them. So they were kind of annoyed with him and that sort of thing. But the tone seemed to be respectful of that. One of the problems that they talked about was Zamora was the lone witness. We have a single witness that's credible of a very unusual craft. There's landing traces left behind, and those were photographed that evening. You see the pictures in the Project Blue Book files. There's rocks around the landing traces, so you can still see the landing traces days later. There was what we call a burning bush, if you will, where this blue flame kind of set it on fire as it took off. But when they got down and touched it, they could feel no heat from it. So it was kind of an anomalous idea there as well. And I don't think of many interstellar craft that are going to be using a kind of chemical rocket to take off. You would think there would be a more sophisticated type of propulsion, but that's what Lonnie Zamora reported. That's what the evidence was left behind. And so the Air Force investigated. They took measurements. Philip Klass uh, diagrammed this on a map, a flat map of the terrain, and he said, well, the landing gear was asymmetrical. Problem is, he didn't take the terrain objects into account. So one landing gear might have been 2 feet lower than another one, and the craft was stabilized that way. So the criticisms of the Zamora case have never really been very good. I think Philip Klass also talked about, well, the mayor and Zamora had gotten together to set up this story so that the mayor could build some kind of a resort area in this land that he loaned. Turned out the mayor didn't own the land, and the idea for the resort came a year after the sighting. So Klass's analysis was flawed from the beginning. What we're left with is a case where we have the Zamora seeing it. There's a guy who ran a gas station, a car, Cadillac, pulled up to the gas station, and the owner of the car said, you guys are flying those special craft awfully low around here. Problem is, we only have the gas station's owner talking about having talked to the people from in the Cadillac, but it adds a dimension to the case, even though the information was secondhand. But it adds that. Later on, we found additional witnesses, and I mentioned, the three people that saw it, uh, object in the sky. They weren't interviewed, and there was no attempt to find those people. In Socorro, at the time, given that we knew the directions of flight, they could have narrowed down the research area to just a couple of neighborhoods.
Yes, I mean, you've mentioned a number of times now, Kevin, that the Air Force were investigating the incident. What was the status of that investigation, given what we know about Roswell? I mean, what were they what were they investigating? What was the remit of their investigation?
Well, you have to leave Roswell out of the case because in 1964, nobody was talking about Roswell. We had no idea about it. There had been a report of a crash in Aztec, New Mexico in 1948, which was pretty well debunked by a number of newspaper sources. So in the UFO community, the idea of a crash was pretty much rejected. So Roswell's really out of the picture. Now we're dealing directly with UFOs. The Project Blue Book feeling was there's no such thing as alien visitation. So there was this idea that we've got to explain all these cases because obviously it's not alien visitation. They sent J. Hynek, an astronomer, who was their consultant for a very long time, and then finally came to the conclusion, and this case kind of helped him, the conclusion that there was nothing no explanation for it, and there may have been an alien visitation. But the Air Force sent him, and he was there for about a week. There was another case that took place the next night in another area of New Mexico. Hynek wanted to go investigate that because some of the details were similar, but the Air Force said, no, you can't do that, and made him come back. So the Air Force attitude was, we've got to solve this case, but they couldn't do it easily. So they just kind of moved the pieces around so they weren't left with this glaring explanation. And in 1964, we did not have access to the Project Blue Book files. Although they said they weren't classified, we had problems with getting access to them because there was classified material in there, and the documentation proves that. So we're left with what the Air Force is talking about, and then we have to look at the civilian investigators. And Jim and Cora Lorenzen, who are friends of mine and very meticulous in most of their investigations, were pro-UFO, so they kind of balanced out the anti-UFO aspect of it. And when they showed up, one of the Air Force NCOs said something derogatory about, oh, the Lorenzens are here now. So we've got that kind of dichotomy working there. Nobody was doing a unified investigation of virtually anything at that time in the United States. There was always that dichotomy of the Air Force, we're going to explain it, and the civilian UFO researchers who had a more liberal view of it. And the Lorenzens, as well as NICAP, that would have been Don Kehoe and his crowd, were often meticulous in their investigations. And if there was a plausible solution, they offered it. Well, we saw this thing, and this is what we believe it was. So you had the Air Force denying it completely, and you had the civilian world saying, yeah, it's in this case of Socorro, yeah, it's very unusual, it's very strange. And you had the news media that didn't really care one way or another because it's a flying saucer.
Exactly. Now, central to this case is the police officer, Zamora, at the center of it. How credible a witness was he?
Lonnie Zamora, and I don't want to say this derogatorily, but he was not the brightest bulb in the display. But he was a very religious man. He belonged to the New Mexico National Guard, and he was a police officer, and he did his job very well. So he was meticulous about this, but he was also very religious, and he thought it might be some kind of I don't want to really say demon, but some kind of religious manifestation that kind of frightened him. And it was Sam Chavez that kind of calmed him down from that. One of the things that Zamora did was there was a symbol on the craft, and he drew it on a scrap of paper so he wouldn't forget exactly what it looked like. And he, of course, gave it to Captain Holder and the FBI agent who also investigated that time, a guy named Burns. So we had the Army investigating. Holder provided about a half-page single space to the Pentagon that night about what had gone on, and we had Burns advising Zamora about it. And they were giving information like I'm not sure which one said it, but I think it was Burns who cautioned Zamora about talking about the creatures because there would be ridicule associated with that. So that would kind of destroy the credibility of the case. And Holder, I think, said, don't tell anybody what the symbol looked like, because if there's similar cases, we can eliminate the copycats if they can't draw the proper symbol. So there was some good ideas going on. We hear the rumors, well, the Air Force tried to suppress the idea that there were creatures. No, they really didn't. They wanted to Burns wanted to spare Zamora some of the problem. But Lonnie Zamora was well respected in the community. I had a friend, Bob Cornett, and we studied UFOs together, and he was also interested in astronomy and physics as I was. And there's the Very Large Array. It's a large radio telescope in Magdalena, New Mexico, which is like 30 miles outside of Socorro. And he was visiting that scientific installation, and he got to Socorro and he called Zamora on the phone just to talk to him. And Zamora says, "Well, we're having a barbecue. Come on down, but we're not going to talk about the UFO." So he didn't want the fame that came with seeing a UFO or seeing the occupants, but he seemed to be a very cautious man, a very straight shooter. I don't think he had the wherewithal to create the story that he did, especially when you have other people talking about the thing coming over, and then witnesses later in the day of some kind of craft in that area. There was a sergeant up in the mountainous area toward the west of Socorro who talked about seeing some kind of a craft about 8 p.m. that night. Zamora's craft took off 5:30 or 6 p.m., so it was a couple of hours later. Quite naturally, the investigation was turned over to Project Blue Book, and they sent J.L. and Hynek in, and he showed up with an NCO. I think he went to Kirtland Air Force Base, which is in Albuquerque, so it's a straight shot down the highway to Socorro, so it doesn't take a lot of time to get there from there. But there was some Air Force involvement. There was a number of Air Force officers who looked at various aspects of the case. There were the civilians that came in to do the investigation. So once the Air Force got there, they limited what Hynek could do and then called him back. As I said, Hector Quintanilla investigated himself. Now, he's the chief of Project Blue Book. At the time, I think he was a major. He went to Alamogordo, which is not far from Socorro, and the White Sands Proving Ground, and he's there with his top secret clearance so that if there's some kind of a government project going on, he can learn what it is and that might explain what the sighting is. He did a book about this case later on, or parts of his book dealt with this case later on, and he said that he could find no explanation for it. He had to label it unidentified. He was stumped by it, and he said it was going to give the UFO community a real boost because he could not solve it. So the case went to Project Blue Book. Well, it should. There's no indication of it being sent to a higher level, or the information being sent to a higher level. I wouldn't be surprised if it had been. We know that there was any number of secret investigations going on in the time from Project Moondust was part of that, and some of the documentation may have gone to Moondust. It may have gone to other government agencies, but the center of the investigation was with the Air Force and Project Blue Book, and what Hynek found when he went to New Mexico. Hynek couldn't find an explanation. He found Zamora to be a honest man talking about what he had seen as honestly as he could, meaning simply that he described it in the terms he could describe it in, but he didn't seem to be embellishing any parts of the story. And as I said, there's other aspects of this that provided additional corroboration. So it wasn't just a standalone case. It was a case where there were other witnesses, not all of them seeing as much as Zamora did, but others adding bits and pieces to it. I got involved in this case. I was talking to Ben Moss and Tony Angiola, who had been researching the case for a number of years. And they said, and I was talking to them, that people had called into the police station that night. And I kept saying, do you have corroboration? Do you have a corroboration? They never answered the question. So I looked at the Project Blue Book files, and in there I found Captain Holder's explanation or his notes from that night talking about 3 witnesses calling the police station. So we've got those people. We have the car that stopped at the gas station. We have the sergeant in the hills. There were other people who talked about seeing things around that time frame in New Mexico. So if you look at the composite of it, you've got a very I don't want to say a very rare case. It's not unique, but it's rare. And we've got bits and pieces of it. But the Air Force's job in 1964 was not really to investigate UFOs. It was a public relations operation to convince people that there was nothing to the idea of alien visitation. And you can see this through the records in Project Blue Book. It began actually in 1953, meaning the idea that there's nothing to it began after a CIA-sponsored panel in 1953 said there's nothing to it and we've got to do this thing. There's always a national security aspect to it. that sometimes rears its ugly head.
In terms of timescale, we're talking April '64. How did the story kind of develop? Did it just disappear off the radar by a few months later, or was it still hanging around for some time?
It appeared virtually the next day. It leaked into the media. There was media response to it. So I think this happened on a Friday evening. Saturday and Sunday and Monday, you hear the stories on the national media here in the United States. I happen to remember it from CBS simply because I was watching Walter Cronkite, but I'm sure NBC and ABC also covered the story at the time. It was in the newspapers. There was illustrations in the newspapers. The APRO Bulletin, which was the newsletter published by the Lorenzens, had pictures of it at the end of April. But the story was hot for a couple of days and it faded away. It didn't really get the kind of investigation that you would like. Ray Stanford, who recently passed away, had done some of the work there. He was there in 1964 when Hynek was there and talked to Hynek, talked to some of the Air Force investigators and that sort of thing. And he had pursued that, and he eventually wrote a book about it, and was often seen saying, I virtually wrote the book on the Socorro case, and that was a good springboard for it. Ben Moss and Tony Angiola wrote a book about it, as did I. So, and I've been in communication with Ben Moss frequently about the Roswell case. We disagree about some aspects of it, but it's clearly something it's a very important case because of all the aspects of it.
Now, a lot of people will be familiar with at least the bare outline of the Roswell case, Kevin. I mean, what similarities, you've researched both, you've written about both. What similarities do you see between Roswell and Socorro?
Well, the biggest similarity is the attempt to keep the information from spreading very far, keeping people from believing in it. In Roswell, the story was killed within like 3 hours. The newspapers come out about 2:15 in the afternoon mountain time, later on the East Coast, with this idea that there had been a flying saucer captured in Roswell. And as you got later in the day, the Air Force was able to display a weather balloon and say, this is what was found out there. Jesse Marcel, who was the intelligence officer in Roswell, saw the pictures later, told a reporter, Johnny, man, that's not the stuff I brought from Roswell. The chief of staff of the 8th Air Force is in some of the pictures, and he said that's not the debris that came from Roswell. That stuff was switched. So there was a concentrated effort to cover up what happened at Roswell. It worked very effectively because you have the story on the 8th with a lot of interest. On the 9th, it's explained, and by the 10th, they're not talking about it at all. In Socorro, you've got a more interested audience. You've got more people talking about it, but it also fades from the public consciousness because we don't have what I guess we think of as a smoking gun. We don't have the craft. We don't have the bodies. In Socorro, we had the landing traces. In Roswell, there was discussion of debris being left behind, but at the time, the Army Air Forces was able to recover that debris, and so we don't have that to present. We have the witness testimonies of high-ranking military officers in Roswell. Every member of Colonel Blanchard's staff, Colonel Blanchard being the commanding officer, every member of his staff we were able to talk to, with one exception, told us it was secret, it was extraterrestrial. I talked to a major, later Colonel Edwin Easley, who was the provost marshal, the top cop on the base, responsible for security. And I asked him at one point, are we following the right path? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, we think it's extraterrestrial. And he said, well, let me put it this way. It's not the wrong path. So we have hints from people that we interviewed 35, 40 years later, talking about Roswell being extraterrestrial. In Socorro, we've got the people talking about it at the time, but other things drove it, I don't want to say underground, but drove it off the front pages, and it was quickly forgotten.
Well, talk to me a little bit about that, Kevin. How did it manifest itself in popular culture? And of course, how did you get drawn to it in the first instance?
You mean in Socorro or Roswell?
Socorro.
Socorro. As I say, I was interviewing Ben Moss and Tony Angiola about it, and they mentioned phone calls into the police department. And when I asked him, I think I asked him 3 times during the course of the interview about that. Is there a police blotter? Is there a police log? And I never got an answer. And that drove me to the Project Blue Book files, where I found Richard Holder's uh, brief analysis mentioning that. So it confirmed what they were saying, and it kind of dragged me into it. And I talked to a number of people. The historian who lives in Socorro, for example. I talked to a fellow who, under the auspices of the mayor's office, and interviewing Lonnie Zamora, drew what the craft looked like according to Zamora. So there was that interest in the local scene. But the problem is, it was a flying saucer story, and by that time we're used to the ridicule associated with it. Even in 1947, there's a headline, and I remember it said, uh, UFO or flying saucer seen in 38 states except Kansas. And the gag was Kansas was a dry state. You couldn't drink alcohol legally in Kansas. So it was the people who were drinking alcohol were seeing the flying saucers. And we saw that, talking about the witnesses being uneducated, farmers with 3 teeth wearing bib overalls. And you look at the strangest cases, the high strangest cases, you find out that the people who are reporting those, if they are inclined to report them, are highly educated and can determine, for the most part, what is in the sky around them. So it's really not a class thing. Yeah, you get the rural people who are not sophisticated, who are not educated, who report the things, but you get the middle class people, you get people from every walk of life. Astronomers have reported UFOs. Clyde Tombaugh, who by the way lived in New Mexico, reported not a flying saucer, but reported a UFO. His wasn't a classic saucer, but I've got a copy of the report that Clyde Tombaugh uh, filled out. Tombaugh, for those who don't know, discovered Pluto. So, I mean, he's a guy who had some credibility in this sort of thing. So you see people from basically all walks of life reporting UFOs, and gets to the point where you talk to pilots. Do you want to report a UFO? No, I don't want to be grounded. And we can point to any number of experiences by people, pilots, who've seen UFOs, reported them, and the next thing they know, they're taken out of the cockpit. The best example is the Japanese Airlines flight 1623, I think it was, where the pilot reported a UFO, and the next thing you know, he's flying a desk. So there's all of that compounding on what's going on, kind of suppressing the information, not only the ridicule factor, but you can find yourself in serious trouble for merely reporting what you've seen. If you remember the opening for Close Encounters, they asked the pilots of the airplane, "Do you want to report that?" And the guy said, "No, I don't think we want to do that." So,
well, in which case, what happened to the police officer involved? What was the subsequent history of Zamora?
well, Zamora stayed on the police force for a while, and he eventually left the police force and had other jobs in New Mexico. He finally retired from the New Mexico National Guard as a mid-ranking enlisted man. But his career in the police department, I don't think, was adversely affected to it the way some other police officers. When you talk to some police officers who've had really strange experiences, you find out within months they're off the police force, not necessarily because of the report, but the pressure from their colleagues and the civilians kind of making fun of them for reporting a flying saucer. But Zamora hung on there for a while. He retired as a city employee, retired from the Army National Guard, and passed away a number of years ago. But I think he was respected in his church. He was respected in the community.
Now, you've written a book about this case, Encounter in the Desert. Kevin, I know it's very hard to do, and we've only got a few minutes left, but what do you think happened that April night, 1964, in New Mexico?
What else happened?
No. What conclusion have you come to as to what happened that night?
I asked the question simply because you broke up the critical part of your question. My conclusion is you have no explanation for it. I have the same conclusion as the head of Project Blue Book for. There is no terrestrial explanation for what he saw. Given the fact that he saw alien beings, given the look he got at the craft, about the only place you can go is into the extraterrestrial. I would like something more substantial, like a lot of photographs of the thing on the ground, but it did leave landing traces on the ground. It did leave footprints, odd footprints of the alien creatures as a I was going to say scampered back into their craft, but you have that sort of thing. So we've got a number of chains of evidence that we can look at that doesn't take us into anything terrestrial. I know they've tried to shoehorn it in to that. I think there's an explanation where they were experimenting with the Lunar Lander at White Sands Missile Range, and it had no power of its own, but it was lifted by a helicopter, and they drifted off range, and that's what Zamora saw. And I'm thinking, I'm pretty sure that a police officer would have noticed a helicopter hovering over the scene, if not just for the visuals, but also for the noise that a helicopter would make.
Absolutely. So the conclusion, or I suppose there's no conclusion, is essentially what you're saying, Kevin.
It's the very classic of an unidentified. We don't know what it is. We think it was extraterrestrial in nature, but if you say to us, well, what is your evidence? We would point to, I guess, the circumstances.
Yes.
And say circumstantially we can get to that point, but and I don't blame the skeptical community. They want something more substantial. They want to see the craft and the bodies, and I don't blame them. I want to see that as well, so we can stop the arguments about this. But if you look at the totality of the UFO phenomenon, from beginning with the Foo Fighters during the Second World War up through the Tic Tacs and the information going on today, in today's environment, you've got a large body of cases with multiple witnesses, interactions with the environment, indirect evidence of the passing of the craft, meaning landing traces, radar tracks of it, and good photographs of it, movie footage of it. We can make a very compelling case that there is something going on that has nothing to do with our terrestrial inventions.
Now, we're coming to the end, Kevin, so very briefly, how does this case and how does this sighting compare to other similar sightings in the United States during that period of time?
Well, when you look at the sightings in that period, specifically 1964, I think it indirectly led to the Air Force commissioning the University of Colorado to study UFOs, to make a scientific study of UFOs. We now know that that was a complete put-on job based on the documentation available. Scientists cited that for decades, and saying there was no national security implications, there's nothing to be researched. And now we're in 2025. That report came out in 1969, and the scientists and the government saying, yeah, we need to look into this. So we've just sort of come full circle. We're back where we were, say, in 1948, 1949, trying to figure out what was going on.
Absolutely. Kevin, for now, tell people where they can find out more about you and where they can pick up a copy of your book on this fascinating case, Encounter in the Desert.
Because, well, you can look at my Wikipedia page. For help. I didn't put it up. I don't know who did, but thank you, whoever put up the page for me. The books are available at Amazon, and I've done 36 books on UFOs, dealing a number of them dealing with Roswell, this one dealing specific with Socorro. So you can see it. I do a blog at kevinrandle.blogspot.com. You can see some of the interviews. I've conducted 200 interviews I've conducted with various people in a search engine on the side. And there's an awful lot of articles that deal with an awful lot of different aspects of the UFO community, including cases that I believe have been solved. So it's not just, oh yeah, there's alien visitation going on all over the place. There are problems with the UFO research community being biased toward finding the extraterrestrial explanation, as there is with the skeptical community rejecting all those sorts of findings. So I try to walk that middle road.
And you do it very well. Kevin, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.